1920 studio portrait found, and researchers are stunned when they zoom in on the mirror. The cardboard box arrived at the Metropolitan Museum's photography department on a gray October morning in 2024, part of a routine estate acquisition from a deceased collector in upstate New York. Sarah Mitchell, a senior curator specializing in early 20th century American photography, had processed dozens of similar donations over her 15-year career, and she expected nothing unusual from this one. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, were approximately 60 photographs spanning from the 1910s through the 1940s. Most were standard family portraits, wedding photos, and vacation snapshots, the kind that filled countless American albums during that era. Sarah methodically cataloged each image, noting dates, locations when visible, and any identifying marks on the backs of the prints. The work was meticulous but familiar, requiring attention to detail, but rarely producing surprises. Then she reached a portrait that made her pause. The photograph showed a young white woman, perhaps 22 or 23 years old, seated in an ornate chair against a backdrop of painted clouds and classical columns. She wore a cream-colored dress with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, her dark hair styled in the fashionable waves of the early 1920s. Her expression was serene, almost distant, her hands folded gracefully in her lap. The studio lighting was professional, creating soft shadows that gave depth to her features. Everything about the composition spoke of careful arrangement and formal elegance. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Catherine, March 1920. Richmond Studio, Philadelphia." Sarah set the photograph aside for digitization, part of the museum's ongoing project to create high-resolution archives of period photography. She moved through the rest of the collection, making notes, but her mind kept returning to Catherine's portrait. Something about the woman's expression held her attention, a quality she couldn't quite name. There was a tension in Catherine's eyes that contradicted the calm pose, as if she were holding something back, concealing an emotion the camera couldn't quite capture. 2 days later, the digitized images appeared in her inbox. Sarah opened Catherine's portrait on her computer screen and began the routine process of checking the scan quality, zooming in to examine details and ensure no information had been lost in the digital conversion. The high-resolution files would allow future researchers to study these photographs in ways that weren't possible with the physical prints alone. She started with Catherine's face, examining the subtle details of her expression, then moved across the image, checking the texture of the dress fabric, the painted studio backdrop, the carved details of the ornate chair. Then she reached the upper right corner of the frame, where an oval mirror hung on the studio wall behind Catherine, partially visible in the composition. Sarah zoomed in closer, her breath caught in her throat. In the mirror's reflection, clear and unmistakable in the high-resolution scan, was another face. A black woman, young, watching Catherine from somewhere outside the camera's direct view. Her expression was intense, focused, filled with something that looked like concern or perhaps determination. The woman's presence in that space, in that moment, should have been impossible. Sarah sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, her heart pounding. In 1920s Philadelphia, particularly in professional portrait studios, the presence of a black woman in the same space as a white client would have been highly unusual, if not completely forbidden. Segregation laws and rigid social customs created impenetrable boundaries between races, especially in commercial establishments that served white clientele. Studio portraits were formal occasions, carefully staged and controlled. Nothing appeared in these photographs by accident, and certainly nothing that would violate the social codes of the era. Yet here was this face, captured in the mirror's reflection, watching the scene unfold with an intensity that suggested deep personal investment. Sarah enlarged the image further, studying every detail she could discern. The woman in the mirror appeared to be in her early 20s, with delicate features and eyes that seemed to carry both worry and resolve. She wore what looked like a simple dark dress, far plainer than Catherine's elegant outfit, suggesting a difference in social and economic status. Her positioning suggested she was standing near the studio's entrance, or perhaps in a doorway, just outside the main photographed area, as if she were trying to remain inconspicuous while still maintaining visual contact with Catherine. The composition of the photograph suddenly took on new meaning. The mirror's placement, which at first had seemed like a standard decorative element of the studio backdrop, now appeared almost deliberate. It captured something the photographer might not have noticed or perhaps had chosen to ignore. Sarah called her colleague Marcus into her office. He was a photography historian who specialized in technical analysis of historical images, and she needed his expertise to confirm what she was seeing and to ensure this wasn't some kind of anomaly or artifact of the digitization process. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to the mirror's reflection on her screen. "Tell me what you see." Marcus leaned in close, adjusting his glasses. He studied the image silently for several long moments, his expression growing more intense as he realized what he was looking at. "That's remarkable," he finally said, his voice quiet with surprise. "The reflection is clear enough to see facial features, expression, even the fabric of her clothing. This woman was definitely present during the photograph session. She was standing in that studio, watching. But that raises serious questions." "About what?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "About why she was there at all," Marcus replied. straightening up and looking at Sarah directly. In 1920, segregation was strictly enforced throughout Philadelphia, especially in businesses catering to white clientele. Portrait studios would never have allowed a black woman to be present during a white client's session, except perhaps as cleaning staff, and even then, not during the actual photography. This is highly unusual. This is essentially impossible according to the social rules of that time and place. Sarah spent the next morning researching the Richmond studio in Philadelphia. Historical business directories from 1920 listed it as a portrait photography establishment on Walnut Street, in the heart of the city's commercial district, operated by a photographer named Harold Richmond. The studio had been popular among Philadelphia's middle and upper-class families, known for its elegant backdrops and professional lighting techniques that produced flattering portraits suitable for display in family homes. It closed in 1927, but its records had apparently been scattered or lost over the decades following Richmond's death. With limited information about the studio itself, Sarah turned her attention to finding Catherine. The challenge was substantial and potentially overwhelming. Catherine was a common first name, and without a surname, searching through 1920s Philadelphia records would be like looking for a specific grain of sand on a beach. She started with census records, marriage licenses, and newspaper archives, hoping for some clue, some detail that might connect to the photograph and narrow her search. Meanwhile, Marcus examined the technical aspects of the image with professional equipment in the museum's conservation laboratory. He confirmed that the photograph showed no signs of manipulation or double exposure, techniques that were known in that era and sometimes used to create artistic effects. The reflection in the mirror was genuine, captured at the precise moment the shutter opened. He also noted subtle details about the studio setup, the positioning of the lights, the quality of the photographic paper, and the composition choices that marked it as professional work by someone with considerable skill and experience. Whoever took this photograph knew what they were doing, Marcus explained, showing Sarah his analysis. The lighting is sophisticated, using multiple sources to create dimension and avoid harsh shadows. The composition follows classical portrait conventions of the era. But here's what's interesting. The mirror's placement seems unusual. It's positioned at an angle that captures more of the studio space than necessary for the portrait itself. Most photographers would have avoided this because it reveals the technical setup, the artificial nature of the scene, the machinery behind the magic. It breaks the illusion that these studios tried to create. Sarah considered this carefully. So you're saying the photographer might have intentionally included that reflection? It's possible, Marcus said cautiously, though I can't imagine why. Or they simply didn't notice it during the session. Photographers in that era worked with large format cameras that showed an inverted image on the ground glass viewing screen. Details in mirrors, especially small mirrors in the background of a composition, could be easy to miss when you're focused on the primary subject. But either way, this reflection tells us something important happened in that studio that day, something worth documenting, even if accidentally. Sarah made a decision. I'm going to Philadelphia. There might be descendants of the photographer or local historical societies that preserved information about the studio and its clients. We need more context if we're going to understand this photograph. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania occupied a dignified building in central Philadelphia, its reading room filled with researchers bent over documents and old photographs, the quiet broken only by the soft sound of turning pages and the occasional whispered conversation. Sarah had called ahead, and the archivist, an elderly man named Robert, who had worked there for nearly 40 years, had pulled several boxes of materials related to early 20th century photography studios in the city. The Richmond studio, Robert said, setting down a folder with careful hands. I remember coming across references to it while cataloging other collections years ago. It was considered quite prestigious in its day, catering to families with social standing. Harold Richmond trained in New York before opening his Philadelphia location in 1918, just as the city was recovering from the influenza pandemic. Sarah opened the folder and found business advertisements clipped from old newspapers, a few newspaper mentions describing the studio's work, and several example photographs from the studio's portfolio that had been preserved in other collections. The style matched Catherine's portrait perfectly. Elegant compositions, classical backdrops, soft lighting that flattered the subjects. But there were no client records, no appointment books, no information about specific sessions or the people who had sat for portraits there. Do you have anything about Richmond himself? Sarah asked, hoping for a more personal angle. Personal papers, correspondence, maybe a diary or business records? Robert shook his head regretfully. He died in 1931, relatively young, and his estate was dispersed among his children. They moved to California in the 1940s, and we've tried to locate family members over the years to see if any papers survived, but the trail went cold. It's a common problem with businesses from that era. When they closed, their records were often just thrown away or lost. Sarah felt the familiar frustration that accompanied historical research. So often the work meant encountering dead ends, gaps in the record where crucial information had been lost or destroyed through simple neglect or the passage of time. She turned her attention to another angle, newspaper archives from March 1920, searching for anything that might mention a Catherine or provide context about that specific time in Philadelphia's history. The Philadelphia Inquirer's archives from that month were preserved on microfilm in the Society's basement. Sarah scrolled through page after page, scanning headlines about national politics, local society events, business news, and the everyday concerns of the city. She was about to give up when a small article on page 7 of the March 28th edition caught her attention. "Society wedding canceled," the headline read. The brief text explained that the planned marriage between Catherine Ashford and James Preston, both of prominent Philadelphia families, had been unexpectedly called off just 3 months before the scheduled ceremony. No reason was given, following the discretion typical of Society reporting, but the article noted that Miss Ashford had left the city shortly afterward, and her current whereabouts were unknown to her friends and social circle. Sarah's pulse quickened as she read and reread the article. The timing matched perfectly. Armed with Catherine's full name, Sarah's research accelerated dramatically. She discovered that the Ashford family had been prominent in Philadelphia's textile industry since the 1880s, building their fortune during the city's industrial expansion. Catherine's father, William, had owned several mills that produced fabric for clothing manufacturers throughout the Northeast, employing hundreds of workers and maintaining contracts with major retailers in New York, Boston, and Baltimore. The family lived in a substantial house in Rittenhouse Square, one of the city's most fashionable neighborhoods, surrounded by other wealthy families who formed Philadelphia's social elite. Census records showed that in 1920, the Ashford household included William, his wife Eleanor, their daughter Catherine, and 2 household staff members. One was listed as a cook, Mary O'Brien, age 45, who had emigrated from Ireland in 1898. The other was listed simply as household help, with the name Grace, age 21, race identified as black. No surname was recorded, reflecting the incomplete documentation typical of domestic workers, especially African Americans, during this period. Sarah felt a surge of recognition and excitement. Grace? The woman in the mirror could be Grace. She immediately contacted a genealogist who specialized in tracking black family histories, knowing that records for African Americans in this period were often incomplete, inconsistent, or difficult to access due to systemic racism in record-keeping practices. The genealogist, Dr. Patricia Williams, was a professor at Temple University who had spent decades reconstructing black family histories from fragmentary sources. She agreed to help search for information about Grace. The challenge, Dr. Williams explained over the phone, her voice carrying both experience and determination, is that many black domestic workers in this era weren't fully documented in official records. Census takers often recorded only first names, employment records were rarely kept by households, and many vital records like births and marriages weren't consistently filed for black citizens. But we can try. I have access to sources that mainstream archives often overlook: church records, community directories, fraternal organization memberships, and oral histories. Do you have any other details? Sarah shared everything she knew. The Ashford household, Philadelphia, 1920. A young woman named Grace who worked as household help and would have been about 21 years old. Dr. Williams promised to search through her network of sources, including the rich archives of Philadelphia's African American churches, which often preserved information overlooked by official institutions. While waiting for Dr. Williams' research, Sarah dove deeper into Catherine's story, reconstructing the social world she had inhabited. She found the engagement announcement from January 1920, written in the flowery, elaborate language typical of society pages. Catherine Ashford, described as accomplished in music and the arts, was to marry James Preston, heir to a banking fortune, in a June ceremony that promised to be one of the season's most elaborate social events, uniting 2 of Philadelphia's most prominent families. But the wedding never happened. The cancellation notice in March offered no explanation, maintaining the discretion expected in such matters. Sarah searched for any trace of Catherine after March 1920, but found nothing in Philadelphia records. Dr. Williams called Sarah 2 weeks later with news that exceeded all expectations. "I found her," she said, excitement and satisfaction clear in her voice. Grace Morrison. She was born in 1899 in Philadelphia, daughter of Thomas and Ruth Morrison. Her father worked as a longshoreman at the docks along the Delaware River, and her mother took in laundry to supplement the family's income. Grace was the eldest of 4 children. She started working for the Ashford family in 1917 when she was 18 years old, likely recommended by her mother, who did laundry for several wealthy families in Rittenhouse Square. "That's incredible," Sarah said, feeling the thrill of discovery that made historical research worthwhile. "Do you have any other information about her life or what happened to her?" "This is where it gets really interesting," Dr. Williams continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "I found a mention of Grace in the records of the Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia, one of the oldest black churches in the country. In April 1920, just a few weeks after that photograph was taken, Grace disappeared from the community. Her parents reported her missing to the church congregation, asking for prayers and any information about her whereabouts. They were deeply worried because Grace had always been responsible and devoted to her family. Her sudden disappearance without explanation was completely out of character." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. 2 young women, both vanished from Philadelphia within weeks of each other in the spring of 1920. One white and wealthy, the other black and working class. The connection couldn't be coincidental. They had to be linked somehow, and the photograph provided the tangible evidence of their relationship. "Did Grace's family ever find out what happened to her?" Sarah asked, hoping for some resolution to the mystery. "There's no record of immediate resolution," Dr. Williams said, "and you can imagine how worried and frightened her parents must have been, especially given the dangers that young black women faced during that era. But here's something else I discovered. I found a letter in the church archives, written in 1952 by Grace's younger sister Hannah, who was responding to a query from someone researching the church's history. In the letter, Hannah mentions that Grace had been very close to the young woman she worked for, that they spent a lot of time together despite the disapproval of the Ashford family and the social conventions of the time. Hannah wrote that she always believed Grace helped her employer escape some kind of trouble, but she never knew the full details. Grace apparently wrote to the family later, letting them know she was safe, but she never returned to Philadelphia." Sarah thanked Dr. Williams profusely and sat back in her chair, processing this information and trying to piece together the narrative. The picture was beginning to form, though much remained unclear and speculative. Catherine and Grace had been close enough that Grace's sister noticed it decades later and remembered it as significant. Sarah needed to understand the circumstances of the photograph itself. Why would Catherine have a formal portrait taken at such a pivotal moment? She returned to the Historical Society and searched through social customs and etiquette books from the 1920s, trying to understand the significance of portrait photography in that era. Portrait sessions were formal, expensive affairs, typically commissioned to mark important life events, engagements, weddings, graduations, or significant birthdays. They were carefully planned, with subjects selecting their finest clothing and studios preparing elaborate backdrops. For a young woman of Catherine's social standing, a portrait would have been expected as part of her wedding preparations, a formal image to be displayed in her new home and distributed to family members. But this portrait was taken in March, just as Catherine's engagement was falling apart. The timing suggested it wasn't a typical pre-wedding photograph. Sarah examined the image again, studying Catherine's expression with new understanding. The distant look in her eyes, the tension beneath the composed exterior, these weren't the signs of a happy bride-to-be. This was something else entirely. Sarah found a reference to the Richmond studio's business practices in a Society column from 1919. The studio offered complete privacy for its clients, with appointments scheduled to ensure that different families never encountered each other. This discretion was part of what made the studio popular among wealthy families who valued exclusivity and privacy. If Catherine had booked a private appointment, the studio would have been empty except for the photographer and any assistants. The presence of Grace in that space would have been Catherine's choice, a deliberate decision to have her there despite the social impropriety it represented. Sarah contacted Marcus again. "I need you to look at the photograph one more time," she said. "Look at Catherine's body language, her positioning, everything. What does it tell you?" Marcus studied the image carefully. "She's seated," which was standard, but notice how she's positioned slightly toward the left side of the frame. "That's unusual. Most portrait subjects were centered. And look at her hands. They're folded, but there's tension in her fingers. She's gripping her own hands tightly. This isn't a relaxed pose. She's holding herself together." "And the mirror?" Sarah pressed. "Is its position really accidental?" Marcus zoomed in on the mirror's reflection. "The more I look at it, the less I think it was an accident. The mirror is angled precisely to capture that doorway area. If Richmond was as skilled as his reputation suggests, he would have noticed this during setup. Unless," he paused, thinking, "unless he was asked to position it that way. Maybe Catherine wanted Grace visible in the photograph, even if only in reflection, a hidden witness to whatever this moment represented." Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. The portrait wasn't just a formal photograph, it was documentation, evidence, a farewell captured on film. And Grace's presence, reflected in the mirror, was proof that Catherine hadn't been alone, that someone had stood by her in whatever decision she was about to make. Sarah's breakthrough came from an unexpected source that arrived via email late on a Friday evening. She had posted an inquiry on a genealogy forum several weeks earlier, asking if anyone had information about the Ashford family of Philadelphia. A woman named Jennifer responded, explaining that her grandmother had been William Ashford's niece, making her a distant relative of Catherine. Jennifer's family still had some old boxes of papers from that side of the family, stored in her mother's attic in suburban Philadelphia, untouched for decades. "I don't know if there's anything useful," Jennifer wrote, "but my mother mentioned something about old letters when I told her about your inquiry. You're welcome to look through everything if you'd like." Sarah drove to Jennifer's mother's house the following Saturday morning, arriving at a modest colonial home in a quiet neighborhood. The attic was cramped and hot despite the cool autumn weather outside, filled with furniture, holiday decorations, and boxes accumulated over generations of family life. Jennifer's mother, an energetic woman in her 70s named Diane, helped Sarah locate the 3 boxes marked with the Ashford name in faded ink. Inside the 3rd box, beneath photograph albums filled with images of people whose names had been forgotten, beneath legal documents and property deeds, Sarah found a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The envelopes were addressed to Eleanor Ashford at the Rittenhouse Square address, and the return addresses showed they came from various locations across the country. New York, Chicago, Denver, even San Francisco. The dates ranged from 1921 to 1935, spanning more than a decade. "May I read these?" Sarah asked, her hands trembling slightly with anticipation. Diane nodded, settling into an old chair. "I've never really looked through them carefully. They were my great-aunt's letters. My grandmother rarely spoke about that branch of the family. There was some kind of scandal that happened before I was born, but she would never explain what it was. She just said that Catherine had made choices that the family couldn't accept." Sarah carefully opened the first letter, postmarked from New York in June 1921, more than a year after Catherine's disappearance. The handwriting was elegant and precise, the product of excellent education. "Dear Mother," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well, though I suspect you may not wish to hear from me. More than a year has passed since I left Philadelphia, and I want you to know that I am safe and that I have found meaningful work here. I teach music to children in a settlement house on the Lower East Side, and while the pay is modest, the work brings me joy and purpose in a way that my former life never did. I work with immigrant families, helping their children learn English through songs, and I find deep satisfaction in this work. I understand that you and Father can never forgive my choice to leave, to abandon the marriage you had arranged, to reject the life you had planned for me. But I could not live the lie that my marriage to James would have been. Please know that I think of you often, and hope that someday you might understand why I had to leave. Aye." Sarah continued reading through the letters chronologically, each one revealing more of Catherine's new life and the reasons behind her dramatic departure from Philadelphia. In a letter from 1923, Catherine wrote about her life in Chicago, where she had moved to work at a school for immigrants, teaching English and music. She described her small apartment, her independence, her satisfaction in supporting herself through meaningful work rather than living off family wealth or a husband's income. But it was a letter from 1925, written from San Francisco, that finally revealed the complete truth about what had happened in Philadelphia 5 years earlier. Sarah read it twice, her heart pounding with the weight of what Catherine had endured. "Mother, I know you have wondered all these years why I left so suddenly, why I refused to marry James, why I would abandon everything our family had built. I think enough time has passed that I can finally tell you the truth, though I doubt it will bring you comfort or understanding. James was not the man you and Father believed him to be. In the months before our wedding, during the social events and private dinners that brought our families together, I discovered that he was violent. I learned from servants in his family's household that he had struck women before, that his previous engagement had ended because his fiancée had fled after he hurt her, and that his family had paid substantial amounts of money to keep these incidents quiet and to prevent any scandal from affecting his reputation. When I tried to tell Father about what I had learned, when I begged him to reconsider the engagement, he dismissed my concerns entirely. He said I was being hysterical, that I was listening to servants' gossip, that I was being influenced by modern ideas about women's independence. He insisted that marriage required compromise, that all men had tempers, and that I would learn to manage James's moods as wives had always done. He said that our family's business relationship with the Preston family was too important to jeopardize over my emotional concerns. The letter continued, and Sarah read with growing horror and admiration at what Catherine had faced. I realized then that no one in my world would protect me, that if I married James I would be trapped in a life of fear and pain with no recourse and no escape. I began to plan my departure in secret, saving money for my allowance, making discreet inquiries about employment possibilities for women. Grace was the only person who believed me. She had worked briefly in the Preston household years earlier and had witnessed James's temper firsthand. She had seen the bruises on a housemaid there, had heard the woman's quiet crying late at night. Grace understood the danger I faced, and she never questioned my decision to leave. She helped me plan everything, at great risk to herself. On the day I had my portrait taken at the Richmond studio, I was saying goodbye to the life I was supposed to lead. I wanted one final image of myself as Catherine Ashford before I became someone else entirely. Grace came with me to that appointment, even though she knew the danger of being present in a white-only establishment. The final letters revealed the full extent of Grace's sacrifice and Catherine's gratitude. In a letter from 1928, Catherine wrote explicitly about the help Grace had provided. Grace gave me all the money she had saved over 3 years of work, nearly $50 that represented her dreams of helping her family or perhaps starting her own business someday. She directed me to a boarding house run by a woman from her church, a widow who helped women in difficult situations. Grace packed my belongings, arranged for their shipment to New York, and stayed with me through that terrifying final night in Philadelphia. The next morning, she walked with me to the train station before dawn, making sure I boarded safely. For helping me, Grace lost her position with our family, lost the security of steady employment, and faced the possibility of much worse given the laws and customs of our time. Father was furious when he discovered my departure, and he blamed Grace entirely. She had to leave Philadelphia to be safe from his anger and his influence. Yet she never regretted helping me, just as I will never stop being grateful to her. Sarah discovered that Catherine had sent money to Grace's family for years, had helped Grace's younger brother attend college, and had maintained correspondence with Grace throughout their lives. The two women had built successful lives far from Philadelphia, connected by the bond formed in those desperate weeks in 1920. Dr. Williams found the rest of Grace's story through church and employment records. After leaving Philadelphia, Grace had worked as a dining car attendant on the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the better employment options available to black women. She eventually became a supervisor, married a railroad porter named Samuel, and raised 3 children in Chicago. She remained active in her church community throughout her life and lived to be 76 years old. Most remarkably, Dr. Williams located an oral history interview conducted with Grace in 1968, part of a project documenting black railroad workers' experiences. In the recording, Grace spoke briefly about helping a young woman escape a dangerous situation in her youth, calling it the right thing to do, regardless of the personal cost. Sarah compiled everything into a comprehensive exhibition for the Metropolitan Museum. The portrait of Catherine, with Grace's face reflected in the mirror, became the centerpiece. Sarah included historical context about segregation, domestic labor, and the limited options available to women in 1920, alongside Catherine's letters and Grace's story. Before the exhibition opened, Sarah contacted Grace's granddaughter Angela, who still lived in Chicago. They met, and Sarah shared the photograph and the complete story. Angela wept as she saw her grandmother's young face reflected in that mirror, seeing visual proof of the courage and compassion that had defined Grace's character. The exhibition opened in November 2024. Sarah's gallery talk drew standing room-only crowds as she explained how the photograph revealed a hidden history of friendship that transcended the brutal social divisions of its era. Visitors stood before the portrait, discovering Grace's reflection for themselves, understanding that this simple photograph documented an act of profound courage and love. The photograph that had seemed so ordinary at first glance became recognized as extraordinary evidence of human connection in an unjust world. Both Catherine and Grace, separated by race and class but united by genuine friendship and mutual courage, received the recognition they deserved. Their story, hidden for more than a century in the reflection of a mirror, finally emerged complete, inspiring everyone who encountered it to look more carefully at history and to recognize the hidden stories of courage that surround us, waiting to be discovered.